The morning sun filtered through the thick canopy of planet Belthara as Dr. Jiwon Kim adjusted her field scanner one more time. The device beeped softly in her hands, showing readings of the strange plants around her. She wiped sweat from her forehead and looked up at the massive trees that reached toward the sky like ancient pillars. "Dex, are you getting similar readings over there?" Giwon called out to her research partner, the crystalline being turned toward her, their translucent blue body catching the filtered sunlight. Dex's species, the Vithri, communicated through patterns of light that danced across their surface. Right now, those patterns showed curiosity mixed with excitement. "Yes, Dr. Kim, these plant formations are unlike anything in our database. The root systems appear to be connected in ways that suggest collective intelligence," Dex replied, their voice coming from a small translator device attached to their chest. G1 smiled. After 3 months working together on this research expedition, she had grown fond of her alien colleague. The Vethri were known throughout the galaxy for their scientific minds and peaceful nature. Dex had become not just a research partner, but a friend. The two scientists had been studying the forests of Belthara for weeks now. The planet was one of the newer discoveries of the Galactic Federation, and its ecosystem was proving to be more complex than anyone had expected. The trees here grew in perfect circles, creating natural clearings that seemed almost too organized to be random. The plant life showed signs of communication that scientists were only beginning to understand. "We should head back to the transport," Jiwon said, checking her watch. "The afternoon storms are starting earlier this week." Dex's light patterns shifted to agreement. They carefully placed their equipment in a protective case and began walking toward the small clearing where their transport craft waited. The vehicle was a standard Federation survey ship, designed for short trips and basic research missions. As they approached the craft, Giwon noticed something odd. The usual sounds of the forest had gone quiet. No bird calls, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush. Even the constant hum of insects had stopped. "Dex, do you sense anything strange?" she asked. The Vethri paused, their crystalline forms shifting as they extended their natural sensors. "The electromagnetic patterns in the area have changed. There is interference I cannot identify." Giwon felt a chill run down her spine. In her years of field research, she had learned to trust these moments of unnatural silence. They usually meant danger was near. They reached the transport and quickly loaded their equipment. Jiwon ran through the pre-flight checks, while Vex secured their samples in the storage compartment. Everything seemed normal with the craft itself. "Let's get back to the base," Guan said, starting the engines. "We can analyze the samples there." The transport lifted off smoothly, rising above the forest canopy. Giwon set course for the Federation Research Station, which was located about 50 kilometers to the east. The flight should take no more than 20 minutes. For the first few minutes, everything went well. Transport flew steadily through the clear air above the forest. Giwon relaxed slightly, thinking that perhaps her earlier concerns had been unnecessary. Then the first warning light appeared on the control panel. "Engine temperature rising," Yuan muttered, checking the readings. "That's odd. The cooling system should be handling this easily." More warning lights began flashing. The navigation system started showing error messages. The communication array went dead. Within moments, nearly every system on the transport was failing. "Dr. Kim, what is happening?" Dex asked, their light patterns now showing clear alarm. "I don't know," Juan replied, fighting to keep control of the craft. "It's like something is interfering with all our systems at once." The transport began to lose altitude. Guan tried to restart the engines, but they would not respond. The backup power systems flickered on and off randomly. She had never seen anything like this before. "We're going to have to make an emergency landing," she told Dex. "Can you send out a distress signal?" "I am trying, but the communication system is completely unresponsive," Dex replied. G1 looked down at the forest below. The trees were thick and tall, with very few open spaces, large enough for a landing. She spotted a small clearing ahead and turned the transport toward it, hoping they could reach it before losing all power. The craft was dropping fast now. Giwan used every bit of her piloting skill to guide them toward the clearing, but she could tell they were coming in too steep and too fast. This was not going to be a gentle landing. "Hold on, Nex," she shouted over the sound of failing systems. The transport hit the tops of the trees with a tremendous crash. Branches scraped against the hull as they plowed through the canopy. Guan was thrown forward against her restraints as the craft bounced and tumbled through the forest. Finally, with a grinding impact that shook every bolt in the hull, the transport came to rest at the bottom of a small ravine. Steam rose from the damaged engines, and warning lights flickered weakly in the dim cabin. Giwan's head was spinning, and she could taste blood in her mouth. She checked herself for injuries and found several cuts and bruises, but nothing seemed to be broken. Then she remembered her companion. Dex, are you okay?" She turned to look at the Vithari and felt her heart sink. Dex's crystalline body was cracked in several places, with bright blue fluid leaking from the fractures. Their light patterns were flickering weakly, like a dying bulb. "I am damaged," Dex whispered through their translator. "My structural integrity has been compromised." Giwan quickly unbuckled herself and moved to her friend's side. She had some basic medical training, but she had never dealt with injuries to a Vithari before. Their biology was completely different from humans. "Don't try to move," she said, examining the cracks in Nex's body. "I'm going to see what medical supplies we have." She found the emergency medical kit and opened it with shaking hands. Of the supplies were designed for human injuries, but there were some universal items that might help. She found a sealing compound that was supposed to work on different types of wounds. As she worked to stop the leaking fluid, Chuan became aware that they were being watched. She looked up through the cracked windscreen and saw a pair of glowing eyes in the shadows between the trees. The eyes were large and seemed to be studying them with intelligence. The creature stepped closer. Juan got her first clear look at it. It was about the size of a large house cat, but with 6 legs and a sleek dark coat marked with patches of bioluminescent fur. Its eyes were large and expressive, and it moved with a grace that suggested it was perfectly at home in this forest. The creature sat down at the edge of the clearing and simply watched them. It made no aggressive moves, but it did not leave either. Juan found its presence both unsettling and somehow comforting. "We have an audience," she told Dex quietly. The Vithari's light patterns flickered in what might have been curiosity. "Local wildlife. They are more intelligent than our initial surveys suggested." Giwan continued working on Nex's wounds, very aware that the strange creature was observing every move she made. She had the distinct feeling that it was not just watching them, but actually studying them, trying to understand what they were doing. As night began to fall in the alien forest, Guan realized that their situation was more serious than she had. First thought, they were stranded far from help, with no way to communicate with the outside world. Dex was seriously injured and needed medical attention that she could not provide. And somewhere in the darkness, beyond their crashed transport, glowing eyes continued to watch and wait. The creature that would later be known as Silu had been following the strange flying object for most of the day. From high in the trees, Silu had watched it move across the forest canopy with curiosity. The forest watchers rarely saw such things, and this one had been making odd noises and flashing lights. When the object began to fall from the sky, Silu followed it down through the trees. The crash was loud and violent, sending birds flying in all directions. But Silu did not run. Instead, the forest watcher moved closer to see what had happened now. As darkness settled over the forest, Silu sat perfectly still and watched the 2 strange beings inside the broken flying thing. One was small and soft, with pale skin and dark hair. The other was larger and seemed to be made of blue crystal that caught what little light remained in the clearing. Silu had never seen creatures like these before. They were not from this world, that much was clear. But what fascinated Silu most was the way the small one cared for the injured crystal being. Throughout the long night, Guan worked without stopping. She had torn pieces of cloth from her own clothes to help seal the cracks in Nex's crystalline body. Her hands were cut and bleeding from handling the sharp crystal fragments, but she did not seem to notice or care. The bleeding has stopped for now, Juan said softly to Dex. I need to find a way to stabilize these larger cracks. Dex's light patterns were very weak now, barely visible in the darkness. Dr. Kim, you should rest. There is nothing more you can do tonight. No, Juan said firmly. I'm not giving up on you. We're going to get through this. From the shadows, Silu watched this exchange with growing interest. The forest watcher could not understand the words, but the meaning was clear. The small soft one was refusing to abandon the injured crystal one, even though doing so would be easier. This behavior reminded Silu of something important. In Silu's own species, pack members never abandoned each other. When one was hurt, the others would stay and protect them, even at great personal risk. But these two beings were clearly not the same species. They looked completely different from each other. Yet the small one's actions showed the same. Fierce loyalty that Silu recognized from family bonds. This was puzzling, but also deeply moving to the forest watcher. As the hours passed, Giwan's exhaustion became more obvious. She swayed on her feet and had to catch herself several times to keep from falling. Her hands shook as she worked, and she had to stop frequently to rest. Please, Dr. Kim, Dex whispered. You need sleep. You cannot help me if you collapse. I'll sleep when you're stable, Jiwan replied, though her voice was getting weaker. Just let me check this seal one more time. Silu could see that the small one was pushing herself beyond her limits. In the forest, this kind of behavior usually meant death for both the caregiver and the injured one. But still, the small being continued to work. The forest watcher began to understand something important. These strange beings possessed something that Silu had rarely seen, even among the forest watchers. They had a bond that went beyond species, beyond logic, beyond self-preservation. The small one was willing to sacrifice everything for the crystal one. As dawn approached, Guan finally collapsed. She had been working for over 12 hours straight, and her body could take no more. She fell to her knees beside Dex, her head dropping forward in exhaustion. I'm sorry, she whispered. I'm so sorry, Dex. I should be stronger. Dex's light patterns flickered with what might have been affection. You have done more than anyone could ask.
I'll rest now, my friend.
But Jiwan fought to stay awake.
She lifted
her head and looked around the clearing with tired eyes. That was when she noticed that the glowing eyes were still there, still watching them from the edge of the forest. We're still being watched, she said quietly to Dex. Perhaps it is simply curious, Dex replied weakly. G1 studied the creature in the growing dawn light. It was beautiful in its own way, with sleek dark fur and those distinctive bioluminescent patches that glowed softly in the dim light. Its 6 legs were perfectly proportioned, and it moved with an grace that spoke of intelligence. It's been there all night, G1 realized. Could have left or attacked us, but it just stayed. Something in that observation made her feel less alone. Even if the creature was just curious, its presence was somehow comforting. She was too tired to be afraid anymore. Silu watched as the small one finally gave in to exhaustion and lay down beside the crystal one. But even in sleep, she kept one hand on her companion, as if to reassure herself that the crystal being was still there. This sight made Tilyu's decision for the forest watcher. These strange beings had shown something rare and precious. They had shown that love and loyalty could exist between completely different forms of life. The small one had risked everything to help the crystal one, asking for nothing in return. In Silyu's simple but profound understanding, this made them worthy of protection. They had proven themselves to be good beings. Beings who cared for each other the way pack members should. Silu rose from the watching position and moved slowly toward the crashed transport. The forest watcher had made up their mind. These strange beings would not be abandoned to die in the forest.
House.
They would be helped, just as the small one had helped the crystal one. As Silu approached the wreckage, several other forest watchers emerged from the shadows. They had been watching too, drawn by the unusual situation. They communicated with each other through soft chirping sounds and body language. The other forest watchers were confused by Silu's decision. Why help these strange beings who were not part of their pack? Why risk exposure to unknown dangers? But Silu was firm in the decision. These beings had shown the kind of loyalty that deserved respect. They would be protected. When Jiwan woke a few hours later, she found something unexpected. The creature was no longer watching from a distance. Instead, it sat just a few feet away, and around it were several plants that had not been there before. "Vex," she said softly. "Look at this." The Vithari's light patterns flickered as they focused on the plants. "Those are medicinal herbs.
I
Recognize them from our botanical surveys. They have healing properties." Guan looked at the creature with new understanding. It had not just been watching them, it had been helping them. "You brought these, didn't you?" she asked the creature softly. Silu tilted their head, studying Juan's face. Then, very slowly, the forest watcher moved closer to where the X lay injured. Silu sniffed carefully at the crystal wounds, then looked back at Jiwan. The meaning was clear. The creature was offering to help. "I think," Guion said with wonder in her voice, "I think you understand what we need." For the first time since the crash, she felt a spark of hope. They were not alone in this strange forest. They had found an ally. One who had chosen to help them for reasons she could not fully understand. As the morning sun grew stronger, Jiwan began to prepare the medicinal plants the creature had brought. She did not know if they would help Vex, but she was willing to try anything, and watching over them both. Silu settled in for what would become a very long vigil. Guan knelt beside the medicinal plants that Silu had brought, turning them over in her hands. She had studied many plant species during her time on Vale'Thera, but she had never used any of them for healing purposes. The risk of making things worse for Vex was frightening. "These leaves have a sticky substance inside them," she said to Vex, breaking one open. "It might help seal your cracks better than the emergency compound." Vex's light patterns flickered weakly. "At this point, Dr. Kim, we must try everything available to us." Silu watched as Jiwan carefully crushed the leaves between two stones. The forest watcher made soft chittering sounds and moved closer, then began to demonstrate something with their paws. Silu showed Guiwan how to mix the plant juice with water to create a thick paste. "You're teaching me," Guiwan said with amazement. "You actually know how to use these plants." The forest watcher's bioluminescent patches glowed a little brighter, as if pleased that the communication was working. Silu had seen other creatures in the forest use these plants when they were injured. The knowledge was passed down through generations of forest watchers. Working together, Jiwan and Silu prepared the healing paste. When it was ready, Guiwan carefully applied it to the largest cracks in Vex's crystalline body. To her relief, the paste seemed to harden quickly, creating a seal that was much stronger than anything she had managed before. "The pain is lessening," Vex said, their light patterns becoming slightly more stable. "This treatment is more effective than our emergency supplies." But even as Vex's immediate condition improved, Guiwan could see other problems developing. The Vithri's overall light patterns were still too dim. Their body temperatures seemed to be dropping, and their responses were getting slower. "Vix, what do you need to recover fully?" Jiwan asked. "What conditions help your people heal?" "We need
thinner air."
Vex replied with difficulty. "The atmosphere here is too thick for proper healing."
Ow!
"Our bodies process energy differently. In dense air," Guiwan felt her heart sink. The forest floor where they had crashed was in a valley, surrounded by thick, humid air. The thinner air Vex needed would be found higher up, in the mountains that surrounded the forest. "How high would we need to go?" she asked. "The mountain peaks, where the air is thin and clean," Vex said. "But Dr. Kim, that is impossible. You cannot carry me that distance." Juwan looked around the clearing, thinking hard. Vex was right. The Vethri was much larger than her, and their crystalline body was extremely heavy. Even if she could build some kind of stretcher, dragging Vex up a mountain would be beyond her physical capabilities. Silu had been listening to this conversation, and while the forest watcher could not understand the words, the meaning was becoming clear. The crystal being needed something that was not available in this valley. They needed to go higher. The forest watcher moved to the edge of the clearing and looked up toward the mountain peaks that were visible through the trees. Silu had never traveled to those heights before. The thin air up there was uncomfortable for forest watchers, and there was little food or shelter. But Silu had made a decision to help these beings, and that decision had not changed. The forest. Watcher returned to where Jiwan sat beside Dex and began to communicate through gestures. Silu pointed toward the mountains, then toward Dex, then toward their own back. "I think," Jiwan said slowly, "I think you're offering to help us carry Vex to the mountains." Silu nodded, a gesture that somehow translated across species barriers. The forest watcher moved closer to Vex and carefully examined the injured being's size and weight. Then Silu looked back at Jiwan and made more gestures. "You want to help, Jiwan?" said her voice filled with wonder. "You understand that we need to move Vex, and you're willing to help us do it." The communication was basic, but it was working. Over the next hour, Jiwan and Silu worked together to figure out a plan. Using salvaged materials from the crashed transport, they could build a stretcher that would distribute Vex's weight between both of them. G1 found some strong metal poles from the transport's framework and fabric from the seat cushions. Silu brought more of the sticky plants and showed her how to use them to bind the materials together. The result was crude but functional. "This might actually work," Jiwan said, testing the strength of their creation. "But Silu, that's a long journey. For you, are you sure you want to do this?" The forest watcher's response was to position themselves at one end of the stretcher and look back at Jiwan expectantly. The meaning was clear. They were ready to begin. Moving Vex onto the stretcher was difficult and painful for the injured. By theory, every movement sent cracks of light through their crystalline body, and their light patterns flickered with pain. But they endured it without complaint. "I am ready," Vex said, once they were secured on the stretcher. "Though I fear this journey will be dangerous for both of you. We're not leaving you behind," Jiwan said firmly. "That's not how this works." Silu seemed to understand the tone of determination in Jiwan's voice. The forest watcher's bioluminescent patches glowed approvingly. As they prepared to leave the clearing, other forest watchers appeared from the shadows. They had been watching the unusual cooperation between Silu and the strange beings. Some of them seemed curious. Others appeared concerned. The forest watchers communicated with each other. Through their soft, chittering sounds, Jiwan could not understand the conversation, but she could see that some of them were trying to convince Silu not to make this journey. Silu's responses were firm and determined. The forest watcher had made a choice, and would not be swayed by the concerns of others. This was about more than just helping strangers. This was about doing what was right. Finally, the other forest watchers seemed to accept Silu's decision. To Jiwan's surprise, several of them began bringing supplies. They brought water stored in hollow plant pods, more medicinal plants, and even some fruits that might provide energy for the journey. "They're helping us," Jiwan said with amazement. "Your people are helping us." Silu's light patches glowed brighter, and the forest watcher made sounds that might have been gratitude toward the others. Then Silu took position at the front of the stretcher and looked toward the mountains. The journey would be long and difficult. The path to the mountain peaks was treacherous, full of dangerous creatures and difficult terrain. Silu's species was not built for such travel. The thin air at high altitudes would be challenging for the forest watcher, but none of that mattered to Silu. These beings had shown the kind of loyalty and care that deserved protection. Small, soft one had risked everything to help the crystal one. Now it was time for the forest watcher to do the same, as they lifted the stretcher and began to move toward the forest path that led up the mountain. Guan felt a surge of hope mixed with determination. They were no longer alone in this struggle. They'd found an ally who understood the importance of never abandoning someone in need. The journey ahead would test all of them, but they would face it together, united by something stronger than species differences or communication barriers. They were united by the simple truth that some things were worth fighting for, no matter the cost. Behind them, the other forest watchers watched until the small group disappeared into the trees. Then they returned to their own lives, but they would remember what they had seen. They would remember the day when one of their own chose to help strangers simply because it was the right thing to do. The forest path leading up the mountain was narrow and dangerous. Ancient trees towered overhead, their thick branches blocking out most of the sunlight. The ground was uneven and covered with roots that caught at their feet with every step. Guy, Juan, and Selu carried the stretcher between them, moving slowly and carefully. Dex's crystalline body was heavier than Giwan had expected, and the weight made her arms ache after just the first hour. But Selu seemed to handle their share of the burden easily, the forest watcher's 6 legs providing stable support even. On the difficult terrain? How are you feeling, Dex? Quan asked during their first rest stop. The Vetheri's light patterns flickered weakly. The movement is painful, but I can endure it. I am more concerned about both of you. This journey is dangerous. Selu had been exploring the area around their resting spot while they talked. The forest watcher returned with fresh water and some edible roots. Selu offered them to Giwan, who accepted gratefully. She had not realized how hungry she was until... Now, thank you, Giwan, said to Selu. You're taking care of all of us. The forest watchers. Bioluminescent patches glowed softly in response. Blue moved closer to the stretcher and gently sniffed at Dex's wounds. The healing paste was holding well. But the forest watcher seemed concerned about something else. As they continued up the mountain, the path became steeper and more treacherous. There were places where they had to carefully navigate around fallen trees or cross small streams. Each obstacle required them to lift the stretcher higher or move it at awkward angles. It's causing pain for Dex. But the Vitheri never complained. They endured each jolt and bump in silence, their light patterns dim, but steady. Guan found herself drawing strength from her friend's courage. The most difficult part came when they reached a section where the path had been washed away by recent rains. They stood at the edge of a steep slope, covered in loose rocks and mud. The safe path around it would add hours to their journey. We'll have to go around, Jiwan said, looking at the dangerous slope. But Selu had other ideas. The forest watcher studied the slope carefully, then began to move down it with careful, precise steps. Celia's 6 legs and natural balance made the descent possible, but it would be much more dangerous for Giwan. I can't follow you down there, Giwan called after Selu. It's too steep. Selu stopped and looked back at her. The forest watcher seemed to be thinking about the problem. Then Selu climbed back up and began to communicate through gestures. The forest watcher pointed to themselves, then to the stretcher, then made a carrying motion. Selu was offering to take Vex down the slope alone, while Jiawan found a safer path. No, Jiawan said firmly. We do this together, or not at all. I'm not letting you carry that risk by yourself. Silu's head tilted in what might have been confusion. The forest watcher seemed surprised by Giwan's refusal to take the easier path. Instead, they worked together to find a solution. Using ropes salvaged from the transport, they were able to lower the stretcher down the slope while both of them maintained control. It was slow and exhausting work, but they managed it without injury. When they reached the bottom, Jiwan collapsed. Against a tree, breathing hard, Selu moved to check on Dex, whose light patterns had become very dim during the difficult descent. I am still stable, Dex said weakly, but I fear I am becoming a burden to both of you. You're not a burden, Guan said immediately. You're our friend. We don't abandon friends. Selu seemed to understand the tone of this conversation. The forest watcher moved closer to Dex and made gentle sounds that might have been comforting. Then Selu looked at Jiwan with what she could only interpret as approval. As evening approached, they found a sheltered spot to rest for the night. Giwan was exhausted, but she forced herself to check Dex's wounds and reapply the healing paste. The cracks in the Vitheri's body seemed to be healing slowly, but their overall condition was still concerning. The air is getting thinner, Dex observed. We are making progress toward the elevation I need. Good, Giwan said, settling down beside the stretcher. We'll reach the peaks tomorrow. But as she tried to sleep, Giwan became aware that Selu was not resting. The forest watcher sat at the edge of their small camp, watching the darkness around them. Celia's eyes glowed softly in the night, alert and vigilant. Selu, you need to sleep too, Giwan said softly. The forest watcher looked at her but did not move from the watching position. It was clear that Silu had appointed themselves as guard for the night. Through the darkness, Guan could hear the sounds of the forest around them. There were calls from night animals, the rustling of creatures moving through the underbrush, and occasionally, sounds that might have been larger predators in the distance. She began to understand why Silu was staying awake. They were vulnerable, while resting, and the forest watcher was protecting them from whatever dangers might be lurking in the darkness. "Thank you, Jiwan," whispered to Silu, "for everything." The forest watcher's bioluminescent patches glowed a little brighter in acknowledgement. The second day of their journey brought new challenges. The path became even steeper, and the air grew noticeably thinner. Giwan found herself breathing harder and needing more frequent rests. But Silu seemed unaffected by the change in altitude, continuing to carry their share of the stretcher with steady determination. They encountered their first real danger in the afternoon. A large predator, something like a bear but with scales, instead of fur, blocked their path. The creature was easily 3 times Silio's size, sharp claws and teeth that could tear through metal. G1 froze, not knowing what to do. But Silu immediately stepped forward, placing themselves between the predator and the injured Dex. The forest watcher's small size made them seem almost ridiculous compared to the massive creature they were facing. The predator snarled and moved closer. Silu did not retreat. Instead, the forest watcher's bioluminescent patches began to flash in rapid patterns. And Silu made sounds that Jiwan had never heard before. To her amazement, the predator stopped. The large creature seemed confused by Silu's display. After a tense moment, it turned and disappeared back into the forest. "What did you do?" Jiwan asked in wonder. Silu's light patches dimmed back to their normal glow. The forest watcher looked back at her with what might have been satisfaction, then returned to their position at the stretcher. That evening, as they made camp for the second night, Giwan realized that Silu had not slept at all the previous night. The forest watcher was showing signs of exhaustion, but still refused to rest while they were vulnerable. "You can't keep this up," Jiwan told Silu. "You need sleep too." But once again, Silu took up the guard position as darkness fell. Watcher's dedication was both inspiring and heartbreaking. Silu was pushing themselves beyond their limits, just as Jiwan had done when Nex was first injured, as they settled in for their second night on the mountain. Jiwan looked up at the stars, visible through the forest canopy. Tomorrow, they would reach the peaks where Nex could properly heal. They had made it this far through cooperation and determination, but she worried about Silu. The forest watcher had been awake for over 30 hours now, carrying a heavy burden. While navigating dangerous terrain, how much longer could Silu continue without rest? The answer to that question would come sooner than she expected. The third day of their journey began with a storm. Dark clouds had moved in during the night, and by morning, rain was falling steadily through the forest canopy. The drops were cold and made the already difficult path even more treacherous. Guan woke to find Silu still in the same watching position, exactly where the forest watcher had been when she fell asleep. Water dripped from Silu's dark fur, but the forest watcher had not moved to find shelter. "Silu, you're soaked," Giwan said, moving to check on her exhausted companion. "You need to get warm and dry." The forest watcher looked at her with eyes that were clearly tired, but Silu's determination had not wavered. When Juan tried to guide Silu toward a more sheltered spot, the forest watcher gently but firmly returned to the guard position. "You've been awake for 2 days straight," Guan said with concern. "This is not sustainable." His light patterns flickered weakly from the stretcher. "Dr. Kim, I believe our friend does not trust the forest to be safe while we are vulnerable. This behavior shows great loyalty." Guan looked at Silu with new understanding. The forest watcher was not just being stubborn about sleeping. Silu genuinely believed that relaxing their guard would put all of them in danger. "But if you collapse from exhaustion, that won't help anyone," Juan said to Silu. "We need you strong for the final push to the peaks." As if to emphasize her point, the path ahead looked more challenging than anything they had faced so far. The final approach to the mountain peaks required them to climb over exposed rock faces and navigate narrow ledges. The thin air at this altitude was making Yuan dizzy. She could only imagine how it was affecting Silu. They began the day's climb in silence, focused on the difficult task ahead. The rain made the rocks slippery, and the stretcher became harder to manage as they maneuvered it around obstacles. Several times, Yuan nearly lost her footing on the wet stone, but Celia's 6 legs gave the forest watcher better stability on the treacherous terrain. More than once, Celia's quick reflexes saved both the stretcher and Yuan from serious falls. The forest watcher's exhaustion was obvious, but their skill and determination never failed. "We're almost there," Yuan said as they reached a particularly challenging rock face. "I can see the peak through the clouds." The final climb was the most difficult yet. They had to pass the stretcher carefully from one ledge to another, with Silu scrambling ahead to secure each position. The forest watcher's movements were becoming less graceful, fatigue finally beginning to show. At one point, Silu stumbled and nearly fell from a narrow ledge. Ji-won's heart stopped as she watched the forest watcher struggle to regain balance. If Silu fell, they would all be lost. "Careful," Ji-won called out. "Please be careful." Silu recovered and continued climbing, but the near miss had shaken them all. The forest watcher's exhaustion was becoming dangerous, not just for Silu, but for everyone then. Just as they reached the most exposed part of the climb, they encountered another threat. A large bird of prey, something like a hawk, but with a wingspan twice as wide, began circling overhead. The creature had spotted them on the open rock face and was clearly considering them as potential prey. Yuan looked around desperately for shelter. But there was nowhere to hide on the bare rock. They were completely exposed, and the bird was getting closer with each pass. That was when Silu made their most courageous decision yet. Despite being exhausted and struggling with the thin air, the forest watcher positioned themselves directly over Thex's stretcher. If the bird attacked, it would have to go through Silu first. The bird dove toward them with sharp talons extended. Silu stood firm, ready to fight a creature much larger and stronger than themselves. The forest watcher's bioluminescent patches flashed in rapid patterns, and Silu made aggressive sounds despite their small size. Guan knew she had to help. She grabbed a loose rock and threw it at the diving bird, shouting to distract it. The rock missed, but the noise and movement confused the predator enough to make it pull up from its attack. The bird circled again, looking for another opportunity. But Silu continued to stand guard over Thex, and Ji-won kept throwing rocks and making noise. Finally, the predator decided they were too much trouble and flew away to find easier prey. "That was incredibly brave," Guan said to Silu, her voice shaking with adrenaline. "You could have been killed." Silu's only response was to check on Thex, making sure the Vithari had not been injured during the encounter. The forest watchers' dedication was absolute, as they completed the final climb to the peak. Ji-won could see that Silu was reaching the end of their endurance. The forest watchers' movements were becoming unsteady, and their bioluminescent patches were flickering irregularly. "Just a little further," Ji-won encouraged. "We're almost there." When they finally reached the plateau at the mountain's peak, Guan felt a surge of relief. The air here was thin and clean, exactly what Dex needed for proper healing. They had made it, but as they set up their temporary camp, Guan noticed an immediate change in Thes's condition. The Vethari's light patterns became brighter and more stable almost immediately. Their body temperatures seemed to be returning to normal levels. "Atmosphere here is perfect," Dex said, their voice stronger than it had been since the crash. "I can feel my body beginning to heal properly." Guan smiled with relief and exhaustion. They had done it. They had brought Dex to safety despite all the obstacles and dangers. But when she looked around for Silu, her relief turned to concern. The forest watcher had finally collapsed. Silu lay on their side near the edge of the camp, breathing heavily. The thin air that was helping Nex was making things difficult for the forest watcher, whose species was adapted to the thick atmosphere. "Of the forest floor?" "Silu," Guan said, rushing to the forest watcher's side. "Are you okay?" Celia's eyes were still alert, but the forest watcher was clearly struggling with the altitude and exhaustion. Cilio had pushed themselves beyond their limits to help them reach this place. You need to rest, Guan said, gently stroking Cilio's fur. You've done more than enough. You've saved us both. For the first time since they had met, Silu seemed willing to accept help. The forest watchers' bioluminescent patches glowed weakly as they finally allowed themselves to relax. Guan found some of the softer plant materials they had brought and made a comfortable bed for Silu. The forest watcher settled into it with obvious relief, their eyes finally beginning to close. Sleep, Guan said softly. We'll keep watch now. You've earned your rest. As Silu finally drifted off to sleep, Guan sat beside both of her companions and looked out over the forest far. Below, they had climbed so high, overcome so many obstacles, and faced so many dangers together. But they were alive, and Vex was healing. None of it would have been possible without Silu's incredible dedication and sacrifice. The forest watcher had stayed awake for 3 days straight, carrying them through dangers that could have killed them all. As the sun began to set on their 3rd day in the wilderness, Guan felt a deep sense of gratitude and wonder. They had formed an unlikely partnership that had saved all their lives. In the process, they had discovered something precious about the nature of friendship and sacrifice. Tomorrow, help would come. But tonight, they were safe on the mountain. Peak united by their shared ordeal and the bonds they had formed along the way, the rescue team found them on the 4th day, just as the morning sun was painting the mountain peaks in shades of gold and pink. Guan heard the sound of engines long before she saw the Federation aircraft rising above the forest canopy below. She stood and waved from the plateau, tears of relief streaming down her face. After 3 days of uncertainty and danger, help had finally arrived. Silu woke at the sound of the approaching aircraft and immediately moved to a protective position near Vex. The forest watcher was still exhausted but alert, ready to defend their companions if necessary. It's okay, Guan, said gently to Silu. These are friends. They're here to help us. The rescue craft landed carefully on the rocky plateau, and a team of medics rushed out. They were led by Dr. Yoon Seojin, the head of the Federation research station who had been coordinating the search for them. Dr. Kim, Dr. Yoon said with obvious relief. We've been searching for you since your transport failed to return. Are you injured? I'm fine, Guan replied, but Dex needs medical attention. They've been seriously injured since the crash. Medical team immediately began examining Vex, setting up portable equipment to monitor the Vithary's condition. To everyone's surprise, Vex's vital signs were much better than expected. The crystalline structure is healing remarkably well, one of the medics reported. Whatever treatment you've been using has been very effective. Guan looked at Silu, who was watching the proceedings with curious but cautious eyes. We had help, she said simply. Dr. Yoon noticed the forest watcher for the first time. Is that one of the local creatures? I've never seen one come this close to outsiders before, says Silu, Guan said, moving to stand beside the forest watcher. They saved our lives. Without Celia's help, we never would have made it to the peak. The rescue team looked skeptical. The forest watchers were known to be shy creatures who avoided contact with other species. The idea that one would help crashed. Aliens seemed impossible, but Dex, now feeling strong enough to speak clearly, confirmed Guan's story. The forest watchers showed incredible courage and dedication. They carried me for 3 days without rest, facing dangers that could have killed them. As the medical team prepared to transport Dex back to the research station, Guan faced a difficult decision. She wanted to take Silu with them, to ensure the forest watcher received proper care after their ordeal. But she also knew that Silu belonged in the forest, not in a research facility. What will happen to your friend? Dr. Yoon asked, nodding towards Silu. That's up to them, Guan said. Silu has done enough for us. They deserve to make their own choice about what happens next. Forest Watcher, thank you for everything. Saved us both, and I'll never forget what you did. Silu's bioluminescent patches glowed warmly in response. The Forest Watcher moved closer to Vix, who was being prepared for transport, and made gentle sounds that might have been farewell. I hope we meet again, friend, Vix said, their light patterns flickering with gratitude, as the rescue team prepared to leave. Guan expected Silu to disappear back into the forest. Instead, the forest watcher followed them to the aircraft and sat down nearby, watching the preparations with interest. "I think they want to come with us," Dr. Yoon observed with surprise. "Or maybe they just want to make sure we're really safe," Guan replied. The flight back to the research station was smooth and quick. Dex was taken immediately to the medical facility, where their recovery could be completed under proper conditions. The Vithari's prognosis was excellent. Thanks to the early treatment they had received, Jiwon was debriefed by the station administrators, who were fascinated by her account of the forest watcher's behavior. This was the first recorded instance of a forest watcher actively helping other species, and it had significant implications for their understanding of the planet's ecosystem. "You'll need to write a full report," Dr. Yoon told her. "The Federation will want to know everything about this encounter." "I'll write it," Guan agreed. "But I want to make sure people understand what really happened. Silu didn't help us because they were curious or because they wanted something from us. They helped us because they recognized that we cared about each other." Over the following weeks, as Dex made a full recovery, Giwon worked on her report. She tried to capture not just the facts of what had happened, but the deeper meaning of their experience. The Forest Watcher's actions had shown that compassion and loyalty were not unique to any single species. The report became one of the most widely read documents in xenobiology. Scientists across the galaxy studied it, trying to understand the implications of Silu's behavior. Some called it the first proof that ethical behavior could evolve independently in different species. But for Giwon, the real significance was simpler. She had witnessed something rare and beautiful, the moment when two very different forms of life recognized their shared values and chose to help each other. 3 months after the rescue, Guan received permission to return to the forest. Wanted to find Silu and thank them properly, now that she was fully recovered from the ordeal. Vex, completely healed, insisted on coming with her. They flew back to the area where the transport had crashed, landing in the same clearing where their adventure had begun. Guan walked slowly through the forest, calling Seely's name and hoping the forest watcher would remember them. She didn't have to wait long. Silu appeared from between the trees, moving with the same silent grace they had shown during their first meeting, but this time there was no hesitation. The forest watcher approached directly and allowed Jiwon to stroke their fur. "I wanted to thank you again," Jiwon said, "and to let you know that Vex is completely healed." Cilio's bioluminescent patches glowed brightly, and the forest watcher made sounds that seemed pleased. Then, to Giwon's amazement, Cilio began to lead them deeper into the forest. They followed the forest watcher through paths that seemed to wind toward the heart of the woodland. Other forest watchers appeared among the trees, watching them with curious eyes. These creatures had heard about the events on the mountain, and they wanted to see the aliens who had been deemed worthy of protection. The journey ended in a large clearing where dozens of forest watchers had gathered. It was like a council meeting, with the creatures arranged in a rough circle around the open space. Silu led Jiwon and Nex to the center of the circle and sat down beside them. "I think," Vex said quietly, "we're being presented to the community." The gathering lasted for hours. The forest watchers observed the two aliens with intense interest, studying their behavior and interactions. Jiwon felt as if she were being evaluated, tested to see if she truly possessed the qualities that had impressed Silu. Finally, as the sun began to set, the forest watchers began to disperse. But they did so slowly, each one approaching Jiwon and Nex briefly before disappearing into the trees. It felt like a formal acceptance, an acknowledgement that they had been judged worthy of respect. Dutsa was the last to leave. Approached Jiwon one final time, their bioluminescent patches glowing in complex patterns that seemed to convey deep emotion. Then Silu touched Jiwon's hand gently with their paw before turning and walking away into the forest. As Jiwon and Nex returned to their transport, they both felt changed by the experience. They had not just survived a crash and a dangerous journey, they had formed a connection that transcended species barriers and proved that the capacity for compassion was truly universal. "Do you think we'll see Silu again?" Dex asked as they prepared to leave the forest. "I hope so," Guan replied. "But even if we don't, I'll never forget what they taught us." Sometimes the most important bonds are formed not through words, but through actions. Salu showed us that love and loyalty can exist anywhere, in any form. As their transport lifted off and headed back to the research station, Kiwan looked down at the forest canopy below. Somewhere in those trees, Salu was watching them leave. Just as the forest watcher had watched over them during their time of greatest need, the silent cat of the forest had taught them that heroism comes in many forms, and that the willingness to help others, regardless of differences or dangers, was perhaps the most noble quality any being could possess. Their story would be remembered long after they were gone, a testament to the power of compassion to bridge any gap and overcome any obstacle. And in the forests of Valthera, forest watchers would pass down the tale of the aliens who proved themselves worthy of protection, and the bond that formed between species who chose to care for each other.